Listen here to the words of our mothers, lessons and stories from days of old. Listen here to the words of our fathers, legends and stories from days of old.
All right, so we're back with Journeys Through Bookland, Volume 1, Atalanta's Race, adapted by Anna McCaleb. Most fathers and mothers are almost as glad to have a girl baby born into their homes as a baby boy. But sometimes a king who wants a son to reign after him is very sorry when his first baby is a girl. At any rate, this is what happened in the case of Jasius, and I don't know if I'm saying these words right, a king of Arcadia in Greece. For a long time he had prayed for a son, and when one day his servant said to him, "You have a little daughter," he was very angry. If he had looked at the child and had seen how beautiful she was and what bright black eyes she had, he must have loved her, whether he wanted to or not. But without having seen her, he just cried, "I don't want her. She can never be a king. Take her out on the mountain and let her die." The baby's mother cried and begged, but the king would have his way. And at last a servant took the pretty baby far from its home and left it on the mountainside. While the child lay crying from hunger and cold and fright, a big black bear came along. She sniffed at the child and rolled it over with her paw. But although she was so big and the baby was so little, she never even tried to hurt it. When evening came and the bear went back to her den and to the cubs she had left there, she took the little girl with her, and for a long time the child lived with the bear family in a cave on the mountainside. Her only playmates were the baby bears. Her only playmates were the baby bears. She ate berries and nuts and wild honey as they did, and she grew quite used to being out in all kinds of weather. At last, one day, some hunters saw the little girl and took her home with them. She was very lonesome and cried for her bear playmates, but when the hunters made her a little hunting dress and gave her arrows and a bow and a little spear, she forgot to be lonely and became very happy again. She learned to hunt better than any other girl who had ever lived, and she could shoot an arrow or throw a spear just as straight as a big, strong man. After she grew to be a tall and beautiful girl, she took part in many wonderful adventures which would have frightened any other girl to death, and never once was she hurt. One time she helped some of the bravest and strongest men in all Greece to hunt a great boar with awful tusks, like knives, and fierce bloodshot eyes and long, stiff, sharp bristles. When the boar was finally killed, its head and its hide were given to the young huntress because she had been the first to wound it. One day when King Jasius of Arcadia was sitting on his golden throne with his golden crown on his head, a tall girl walked into the room and straight up to the throne. "Who are you, young woman?" demanded the king, "and how dare you come into the palace and even to the steps of my throne?" "My name is Atalanta," answered the girl, "and I am your daughter. If you don't want me here, I can go right back into the forest where I have grown up." But the king, when he saw how beautiful and how brave she was, for of course it takes a very brave person to speak in that way to a king, said to himself, "She will be almost as good as a son," and he would not let her live any place but in the palace. And it was not long before everyone there became so fond of her that it seemed strange they could ever have lived without her. Many princes came from all parts of Greece and wanted to marry her, but to every one she said, "I don't want to get married, and I'm not going to do anything I don't want to do." "But, my dear child," said old King Jasius, "who ever heard of a princess without a husband? They always marry, and you'll just have to do it." Atalanta pouted. "But I don't want a husband," she said. "I like men to go hunting with, but I'm sure I couldn't bear to have one around all the time to know that he was my husband." Finally, however, when the king insisted, she thought of a way out. "I'll marry a man," she said, "who can beat me in a foot race." "That's fair enough," replied the king. "I'll send word to all the princes, and we'll have a great race." "There's one thing more," added Atalanta. "Every man who tries and is beaten in the race must allow himself to be put to death." She really wasn't such a cruel princess, but she thought that if the young men knew they would die if they failed, they would all go away and let her alone. Her father looked very serious, but at last he said, "Well, anyone who will risk his life in that way is a fool and deserves to die." Word was sent to all the princes, but the most of them thought that while they loved Atalanta very much, they loved life even more, and they stayed away. Some of the princes, however, liked Atalanta so well that they could not bear to give her up without a trial, and when the day came for the first race, a number of strong young men were ready to try their luck. Every day a race was run, and every day at the end of the race some poor man had to lose his head. For no matter how strong they were or how fast they could run, Atalanta beat them all easily. At last the people who watched the races began to feel that there had been enough bloodshed, and wondered if, after all, Atalanta were quite such a nice princess as they had thought her. Atalanta herself was very sorry for the foolish young men, but she could not stop now. For when a princess had once said she would do a thing, it was thought the worst sin in the world for her not to do it. Now, among the princes who came, there was one named Hippomenes. Let's see if I said that. There was one named Hippomenes who did not come to race. He had never seen Atalanta, and King Jasius had asked him to be there just to act as judge. That is, to watch the races and see who really came out ahead. The day before the first race, Hippomenes went about telling the other princes how foolish he thought they were to risk their lives for such a thing. "I should never be so foolish," he said. "No matter how beautiful and how rich the princess may be, she can't be as beautiful and as rich as the life I intend to lead." But he never said such things after that first day. For when Atalanta stood up beside a brave young prince ready for the first race, she looked so lovely, with her red cheeks and bright eyes and wind-blown hair, that Hippomenes fell in love with her on the spot. And as he watched her running and saw how graceful she was, he loved her more and more. Each day as he watched the race, he found himself hoping that she would win, because he could not bear to think of any man but himself having her for his wife. Finally, when all the other princes had run and had been beheaded, Hippomenes said to the king, "And now I am ready to make my trial." The king was surprised and grieved, because he had heard of the speeches Hippomenes had made to the other princes, and because he liked the young man the best of all who had come. But nothing he could say could induce Hippomenes to change his mind. "I love Atalanta," he said, "and if I can't have her for my wife, I want to die." Before going to the race course the next day, the prince, determined but frightened, prayed to Venus, the goddess who took a special care of people who were in love. "Beautiful and powerful goddess," he prayed, "help me to win this race in Atalanta, and I shall never forget as long as I live to talk of your kindness and to make you rich gifts." Now Venus was almost always ready to help people if they would admit they could not get on without her. And while Hippomenes prayed, he saw that what he had thought was a soft white and gold cloud was really the goddess coming toward him with her hands stretched out. She came nearer and nearer and finally dropped right at his feet 3 shining yellow apples. They were not common yellow apples, no indeed. They came from Venus's own garden and were of heavy, precious gold. "I thank you, goddess, for this fruit," said Hippomenes. "In all my life I have never seen anything more beautiful, but how can they help me?" Then Venus stooped and whispered to the youth, and when he again raised his eyes to thank her, she had disappeared. But there was a smile on the face of Hippomenes. He looked as if he were not at all worried about the race. When he stood side by side with Atalanta, however, he tried not to look too happy. All the people looked at him and whispered, for they did not dare let the king hear them grumbling. "Must this youth also be killed? He is the youngest and the handsomest of all, and the king's daughter is too cruel." Atalanta herself was more sorry than she had ever been before she had made the vow about the racing. But when she tried to induce Hippomenes to give her up without a trial, he only smiled at her and said, "Something tells me I shall not fail." Atalanta knew nothing about the 3 golden apples which he had hidden in the front of his loose robe, and when she saw that he was so sure of winning, her cheeks grew red with anger, and she said to herself, "I had thought, because you are so young and look so much nicer than any of the other princes, that I might let you beat me. But since you are so sure, I shall run my best, and you will not be smiling long." There they stood, each with 1 foot forward, each looking light as a bird just ready to fly from a branch. And then, while the onlookers held their breath, the herald gave the word, and they were off. Hippomenes ran like a deer, and at first he was a few paces ahead. But Atalanta ran like the wind, and soon she passed him. Then, still straining every nerve to overtake her, Hippomenes drew out one of the glittering golden apples and tossed it ahead of him. Right in front of Atalanta's eyes it fell, and then it rolled to one side and lay there on the sand. What it was, Atalanta knew not. She only knew that it was beautiful and that she must have it. She turned aside, snatched it, and sped on. But while she stooped, Hippomenes had passed her, and she could see his fluttering robe far down the course. This did not frighten Atalanta. It just made her run faster, so that in a very few minutes she was again ahead. Then Hippomenes threw the second apple, and it came to a standstill so directly in front of Atalanta's feet that she almost fell when she stooped to pick it up. Again Hippomenes heard her breathing as she came close to him. Again he saw her pass him. The goal was in sight now. But the poor youth was so tired and so out of breath that he could scarcely run another step. You see, he had not been having as much practice in running as had Atalanta. But with all his strength, he threw the last apple off to one side of the course. It was almost hidden in the tall grass. But Atalanta had seen as it passed her that this was the brightest and most beautiful of all, and she could not bear to think of anyone else having it. As she raised herself after stooping to pick it up, behold, all the people were rising and were shouting, "Hippomenes! Hippomenes!" And there at the end of the course, with his hand resting on the goalpost, was the young man who had beaten her, panting a little from his running, but looking oh so happy. Do you suppose the princess said that it was not a fair race, that he had not really run as fast as she had? By no means. She was almost as happy as he was as she went up to him with her hand held out to lead him to her father. And the people forgot all about the poor young men who had had to die and were happy again as they shouted, "Hippomenes and Atalanta! Hippomenes and Atalanta!"
So the last race was the judge against the winner, right?
So every race could have had a winner, but this was the only race that did have a winner other than the girl. And that's why she married him.
Punch that subscribe button and relax. So then you know every time when the video comes out. Right now.